So, first things first, what is lights? How many people know about lights? Like, have heard it? Okay, some people, good. Has anyone engaged with us in the past, either when with us or with Laura Starrett previously to us?
Just questions. I have questions. I don't have anybody involved in it. Wasn't suitable.
Okay, so no one really that would have gotten what they need from us. Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. So we're going to talk about what we actually provide, and that could be a factor, right? There could be some people that for them, lights isn't what they're looking for. It's not what they need necessarily, or maybe what they think they need. So what do we do at its very baseline? We're helping families plan for a living situation for their son or daughter outside of the family home without ministry funding. So we're not working with any ministry funding for residential supports. I say families, could be parents, most often it's parents. Sometimes it's siblings, sometimes it's grandparents, you know, whatever the family situation looks like. So we're helping them plan. Okay. What do you need to be eligible for our services? So first and foremost, the individual has to be eligible for DSO residential supports. You know, there are a lot of people out there that don't qualify for DSO residential supports, and unfortunately we're not able to support those folks. But that's where we're going to give you some resources and hopefully some ideas on, you know, what that could look like. So we say must be 18 years of age or older. You know, transitional youth, there's that gray area. And as Alex said, planning can never start too early. We recognize as children, typically if they're planning to move out of the family home as children, there's typically crisis supports or very intensive supports that are required. And we aren't the people that are planning for a crisis. So that's usually not what we're trying to do. But certainly transitional aged youth, you know, we get some parents and they say, my daughter's 15 and I need to start thinking about this. And we say, great, here's some things to think about. So that's good. We are only 2 of us, so unfortunately we are only in Toronto. So that could be people that are currently living in Toronto and looking to continue living in Toronto. Or we have had people that are coming from outside of Toronto that are looking to live in Toronto again. So that's fine. As long as you're looking to live in Toronto or, you know, right on the margins, right? Must be willing to explore options for living situations and network with other families. So this does not mean that you have to be looking for a roommate. This means that you're open to looking, forming, you know, getting some information from other families, looking at some other options that, you know, your mind is sort of open and you're willing to explore possibilities. You know, sometimes when families come and they only have one idea only, that's the only thing that's going to work for them, they could be really limiting themselves in, you know, what this actually looks like for their family member and potentially closing a lot of doors, which is not ideal really for anybody. Must be willing to work with facilitators to develop a comprehensive plan and budget. I mean, I think this is kind of self-explanatory. You wouldn't come to us if you didn't want to work with us, but you know, it's all there. Must be prepared to self-manage the living situation. I think this is one of the biggest ones because our idea is not, we're part of Community Living Toronto. Lights is a program of Community Living Toronto. The idea is not that we're creating, you know, many Community Living Toronto group homes all over the city that Community Living Toronto is managing. That's not the idea. What we're doing is we're empowering families to self-manage those living situations moving forward. We're really there providing support to the families so they can manage that. So we're going to go into what Lights is not at some point, but it is really important that the families do understand that engaging with us doesn't mean that we're making the decisions. Doesn't mean that we're doing, you know, getting everything prepared for them. It's not a traditional residential spot. So, you're not moving into a place that's already there. We're not hiring staff for you. We're really talking to you about what is your dream, what is your goal, and how are you going to get there. We're walking along that path with you. We're not doing it for them. Does that make sense? Okay. Great. Oh, sorry, fast. Okay, so what families can expect when they engage with us? So we went over our eligibility. I think we talked about the services. So what families can expect when they meet with us? I should actually tell you how they meet with us, shouldn't I? They can contact us directly. Yes. So this is not something that goes through the DSO. It's not a referral process. Families can contact us directly. There is contact information in the nice, neat packages that Kirra gave out to all of you. We also have a ton of business cards. Our sort of preferred method is email. We have a phone number also, and they can leave us a voicemail, and we'll connect back with them. But lights@cltoronto.ca, families, we do encourage families to email us directly. Sometimes we do have other professionals that are sending us kind of referrals. But again, I think we want to start from very early on in the messaging that families are the ones that are driving this process and managing this process. So it's really important that families are the ones that are connecting with us. Make sense?
Then if they don't have family, then we're not eligible.
Well, that's not on our eligibility slide, but part of it is a family needs to be prepared to self-manage.
But if the individual doesn't have a family, then the individual may not be able to.
So who does the individual, so the question is if the individual doesn't have a family. No family whatsoever, no cousins, no other family members that are there to help support that individual with financial pieces, with anything. Is there anybody involved in their network that's not a paid support? I mean, it doesn't, like, I use the term family very loosely, but we do need to have someone who is prepared to manage it. Some individuals are more self-managing, and we're happy to work with individuals that are self-managing, but we do need to make it clear that it is not Lights or Community Living Toronto that is managing a living situation. So we wouldn't be a tenant, a landlord, an employer. Does that answer your question? Yeah. So I think individual cases, I think is a conversation, but that is an important piece of it. Because there is only two of us, and the idea is we're empowering families, right? And empowering people to have alternative living situations outside of what's traditional. Or perhaps create something while they wait. Yeah. Okay, so how we work. After families connect with us, sometimes there is a bit of a delay. I wouldn't call it a waiting list. Sometimes there's a bit of a delay in new people contacting us just because of how many people we're working with. So families should expect it might take a little while for us to get back to them. But all said and done, if it's a couple weeks, that's pretty average, right? So when we connect with them, sometimes we'll have a phone conversation. It depends on the family. But we are really out there meeting families one-on-one in their own home if they're comfortable with that. And I don't schedule meetings for less than 2 hours. So we do meet with families one-on-one fairly intensively. There's a lot of relationship building and a lot of facilitation that we're doing. So I think sort of in contrast to Alex's role at the DSO, we are people that are going out and having those conversations with families and talking to them about what do they want for their family member, where they're at. It's really important to us that we're meeting families where they're at that current moment in time. Okay. Quite often there's some education about developmental services, the sector as a whole, what's out there, what they may be eligible for, how they can access it. There's varying levels of knowledge. Sometimes we'll come across a family who's got all the ducks in a row and you kind of leave going, holy smokes, that family knows what they're doing. Unfortunately, that's not the typical. There's a lot of families out there that maybe it's been explained, but they still don't really understand that passport's managed by FST, for example. Or, they don't really know what an APSW is, or, there's a lot of questions, right? Families out there in the community that are not attached to any agency, they have a lot of questions. Okay. One I get a lot actually is, ODSP and the DSO are the same thing, right? You guys probably get that. Well, here's how it works. So we're there as facilitators. Our job role is facilitator. So we're facilitating conversations about what that actually means. Sometimes not all family members are on the same page as to what that means. Readiness is a big thing with families. Maybe dad's ready to let go, but mom really isn't. And then the brother's there kind of going, well, let's just do it, right? So facilitating those conversations and being that objective, third party that can come in, that's not emotionally attached to the situation, it can be really helpful for families to evolve and get closer to being ready for that move, for that transition. So we help them in developing plan. Plan can look many different ways, and quite often a plan development is the result of maybe a year and a half of meeting every month for a couple of hours, maybe longer. We have some people that have been planning with us for almost the whole time we've been around, which is 9 years, almost 10 years. Because sometimes you go in and you meet with people and they say 5 years. That's when I want them to move out, in 5 years. Okay, tell me more about that, right? Sometimes when we go in, they say to me, well, we sold our home and they need to be out in 6 months. Mm-hmm. Okay, do we have a backup plan for where they're gonna live or where are they gonna go, right? And at that point you think, no good planning happens in a time of crisis. That's very much our idea, because families are backed into a corner and they're forced to make decisions that maybe wouldn't be decisions they would have made had they had more time. So, your example, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, but your conversation with Alex about the family that the father passed away and they have a home, right? If there's no supports in place for this man, it can be very difficult to come up with a plan that isn't directly linked to the immediate need for support. Planning takes time. Good planning takes time. It takes energy, and it takes resources, and I'm not just talking about financial resources. I'm talking about, the amount. One mom puts it like this. She said, well, if you're going to do this, you have to have some skin in the game. If you want to go this route, you've got to really throw yourself into it. This particular mother actually sold her home, and she currently rents to buy a condo for her daughter to live in long-term. Her daughter needs quite a bit of supervision because of safety concerns with epilepsy, and she also needs pretty specialized behavioral supports. But she said, families feel like they don't have a choice, but this is coming from a mother, this isn't coming from me. Which can be more powerful to families a lot of the time. Families don't feel like they have a choice, but there's always some kind of choice. And the earlier you start thinking about it, the more choices you have. That's what we're here for. So it's all great, yeah, there's a home that people can live in, but there's so many things about that. How does this look like? Does the individual own the home? Will rent be considered income? Will it affect their ODSP? What kind of partnership agreement will there be? What kind of supports are there in place? Who will be in charge of hiring those supports? What will that look like? If it's an employee, there's CRA to deal with, there's WSIB. There's who's going to maintain this detached home? There's obviously maintenance that has to happen, right? There's a lot of things to think about. Even something like if there's staff coming in, are there appropriate fire exits? What's the liability on this for staff coming in, right? What kind of insurance do you have? So there's an awful lot of things to consider for families rather than just, well, there's a housing crisis, we have a bedroom, someone can move in there. Well, someone coming in is gonna wanna know what I'm getting into, right? And there's gotta be, I've always found that there has to be a very similar philosophy between families, because in our experience, when things go very wrong, it's always because of the families. Some families say it's like being married. There's two people that live there, but if the families don't get along, there's gonna be big trouble. And picture families that have sons, daughters with intellectual disabilities. I mean, they're even more involved than other parents for the most part, right? So having a similar idea of what this means. I'll give you another example. We had a family who purchased the home next door to them. Detached home in Scarborough. Both parents lived next door. They were both retired. And during a meeting, they did find two roommates to share their space with their son, the space in the home next door. And during a meeting when they were about to move in, one of the other mothers says, "Oh, so when will he get a key?" And the mom goes, "Well, why does he need a key? We live next door." You know, there's a living caregiver. Why does he need a key? If there's no one home and the door's locked, he can just come next door. Okay, let's talk about that a little bit more, right? Because obviously for us that's very symbolic. But for this other mother, she just said, "Well, I don't understand why. That doesn't make any sense," right? And she had reasons for it, but it kind of goes back to, what's the idea behind this? You know, what do you think? Why are they living here? They're living here to gain skills. Is this their home, or is this a temporary thing to help them get out of mom and dad's home? So that's important. And often that does not come out in the first few meetings. It's kind of something, you don't know what you don't know. And you kind of have to have those conversations and notice those things. It's a facilitation thing, right? So that's what we do. We ask the hard questions sometimes. Yes, that's why not everyone likes us, because sometimes we ask the hard questions, but that's okay. We're professionals. We provide opportunities to network with other like-minded families. So we do info sessions. That's not the right word. Networking evenings. We're doing a new thing now, and you may have seen it. It's posted on social media. We sent it out. We're doing a networking power hour for families. So the idea is that there's no presentations, but we're going to do an hour. It will be in different regions, so I know all the West End people are like, "It's in Scarborough, why is it in Scarborough?" We will be doing the West End, I promise. And the idea is that families in similar neighborhoods can meet, connect, and talk to other families, with us there facilitating. So that's our new idea. We're happy to get feedback on it because it's something new for us. But we really get, from families, they say they want to meet other families. And, again, Alex is talking about sort of connecting people with other like-minded people. We recognize everyone has very busy lives. These families have, a full-time job of being the quarterback, CEO, personal assistant for their son, daughter sometimes. They have their own lives and they have their jobs. I mean, we get everyone super busy, but networking with other families is so key in this. Getting information, talking to people, hearing stories, looking at potential partnerships down the road. So important. I can't stress that enough. So again, it does take energy from families, and it does take time. Provide anecdotal experiences. I'm always talking about what other families do because I think there's a lot of lessons learned in it, and I think it really helps illustrate, and everyone probably has this experience for families. I can say the same thing as a mom, but it'll be much more powerful coming from a parent, 9.9 times out of 10. Because they're sitting where they sit and they understand them. And I think it's really important. Part of empowering families is to empower them to develop communities of people. We talk about circles of support. Circles of support meaning an informal support network around an individual. That's really important, especially when we're talking about sustainability. There's a lot of talk about microboards lately. Does everyone know microboards? Anyone not know microboards? Okay, so microboards are incorporated, and the purpose of them is to support an individual. So they go through the legal process of incorporating, and essentially it's a group of people who are unpaid that are part of this micro board. So for some families long-term that are looking to do something that's not traditional, they want some oversight, and really incorporating makes people accountable for being there, being part of that board. So you have to start with somewhere, right? And quite often starting that, you need to gather a circle of support together before you can even think about saying, hey, we're gonna form a micro board, right? You can't just, it becomes very hard to say, hey, you know, you're a great support. You know, the example of the man that goes to the coffee shop and some of those other people that are at that social circle. I mean, to sort of say to someone, hey, come and join this board, it's kind of a big ask initially, right? So having an informal circle of support first can be really helpful in that process. So that's for the individual. But we have to remember too, parents quite often feel isolated, alone, like no other parents really understand. And having support for the parents while they're going through this is so, so important also. And having, you know, parents that know what it's like, can share stories, you know, develop friendships even, the dream, right? That's what we're trying to do here. I talked about this, encourage development of collaborative support circles. So that's identifying people, and quite often we hear everyone's busy, no one has the time, everyone has their own lives. Yes, that might be true, but we're not asking someone to step in and be mom. You're mom. In all likelihood, no one's ever going to do as much as you do for your son or daughter. And I say mom, sometimes it's dad, but most often it's mom, right? Sometimes it's dad, I don't want to exclude anybody. You're the parent, you're the parent. But if we can look at, you know, what support you do provide, and maybe what things some people already have skills in or are willing to contribute, and you know, someone's an accountant, maybe managing passport submissions or helping manage funding is actually up their alley, right? So having someone like that, maybe they could be part of that circle and managing that financial aspect. So there's a lot of encouraging families to think about it a little bit differently. That can take some time. Support in developing a budget. So we do provide some support in developing a budget. Along with that, there is a component of financial support that Lights could provide. Now, this is not ministry funding, to be perfectly clear. It's not ministry funding. Any financial support that Lights could provide is time limited, and it's also limited in the amount of funding. And there is the expectation that families are contributing themselves financially to the living situation. So it's up to 5 years, and it is limited in some ways, right? We do have a board. The board does do fundraising, and they've been fairly successful so far. They've raised over $7 million in 10 years, which is amazing. You know, it's privately fundraised, donated dollars, so there's never a guarantee that we'll be able to continue to do that. The intention is not to support someone financially long term. We want to set them up, again, you know, as Alex talked about, we want to help set them up to be in the best possible position should that call for proposals comes out again, or should some money become available to help them advocate for that funding. That's important. But Lights is not a long-term financial solution. Does that make sense? Okay. So now that we've talked about what we do, what we don't do, I think it's a pretty straightforward list. We're not fee for service. So Kirra and I are paid through MCCSS. We don't charge families to access our supports, which is great. We are not accessed through the DSO. So like I said, families can contact us directly. We do not manage homes. So back when I was talking about families must be prepared to self-manage, we're not functioning in the way support staff or supervisors or managers function in agency-run homes. We're very much there to support families and walk with them along that road to make those decisions and to do that on their own. We don't hire support workers, so we really, part of the idea of sustainability is that families, I guess there's a back piece to this, right? There are support workers, and families are always talking about it's so difficult to find support workers. So there are some places, such as Montage, that does offer fee-for-service support staff to individuals that are living in community. We don't do that. Quite often there's a cost component for families. So, some families are very happy to approach the person that works at the drugstore that's really, really nice, like Peter's story. They're happy to approach people that individual has a relationship with that would be willing to support them as maybe an independent contractor or an employee, depending on what that looks like. So we're not the ones that are hiring the support staff for the families. The families are the employee, and that's typically due to costs that they elect to hire themselves rather than going through agency. Okay. We don't have a stock of real estate. If I had a stock of affordable housing, I would be the belle of the ball, but I'm not. I could perhaps provide some resources for individuals. We know that the municipal list is flawed in supporting our folks because it only allows them to wait for a one-bedroom apartment. You're not able to wait to live with your roommate, it has to be family. And it also doesn't take into account supports. So we are hoping that the National Housing Strategy will give us some opportunities. There is quite a lot being done on the affordable housing front. The City of Toronto released some public lands for development. Those are listed on the City of Toronto's website. We have in the past been able to access some units just through being a program of Community Living Toronto. But for example, we have a new development that Community Living Toronto is a community partner of, and it's 200 Madison by Mahogany 2 Developments. So we do have a few units in there that are market rate, average market rate rent, which is well above what ODSP can pay for, right? We know that. But unfortunately, Lights wasn't able to access any of them because there's folks in service with us that needed to move. So that's something, it's great when it comes, but it's not something we can count on. We do have a relationship with a real estate agent, but the listings that she has are market rate, if we're lucky. But she's there and we can refer people to her. Only Lights facilitators can make the referral because they are donating their time to Lights. It's not a fee-for-service type thing, which is nice. And she helps families who are looking to rent or buy. And they donate half their commission back to Lights if they buy. So that's so nice.
Wow.
I know, they're wonderful. We love them. We also support with employment. Again, I think that's pretty, self-explanatory. We don't manage passport funding for individuals. Community Living Toronto used to manage community passport funding for community members. We are no longer able to do that, unfortunately. So we are not an agency that could be managing families' passport dollars for them. We don't make decisions for families. I mean, again, I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but sometimes it bears repeating. Because sometimes families, they'll ask you, what should I do? What would you do if you were me? Well, I'm not you. I'm not in your position. I can tell you what's out there and help you think through things, but I'm not there to make a decision where your son or daughter should live. Who should support them, right? Again, we go back to empowering. Okay. All right, so I just want to check in with our objectives. How to engage with lights, involving eligibility criteria, what to expect from meeting with us. Have we covered off on that? Do we think? Thumbs up, thumbs down? We still lacking? Okay, a couple thumbs up, excellent. Common misconceptions. These are just things I hear through the grapevine, and I just want to clear it up. Lights is just for high-functioning people. We do have a number of people that have engaged with lights that require 24-hour-a-day support. The only caveat to that is that tends to be more expensive, right? So we definitely engage with people of all support levels. The bottom line on the budget can be substantially higher. So again, it all depends on what the family's resources are and what that means, how much they want this to happen. For example, quite often what we see, this is a bit of a trend, we see 3 people living with a live-in caregiver, a domestic worker, which we know the employment laws are slightly different for, because at nighttime, when a care worker is off duty, those are not paid hours. Whereas if you brought someone in from outside who do not live in the residence, then you would be required under employment law to pay minimum wage for all hours that they are there, even overnight. And at $14 an hour minimum over 10 hours, that can add up, right? So in some cases, sharing the cost between 3 people, perhaps there's some resources, perhaps the family has a home, in an ideal world, or they have some sort of inn and they're able to do that. It can sometimes be less expensive than actually hiring people as employees to come in and work overnights. So it's doable. We've seen it done. It just, you just need to think about it a little bit, and that's where the planning comes in. Life has a secret stock of affordable housing. Again, I think I was pretty clear. We don't. I wish I did. We just go out and talk to people a lot, and we try and find out what's happening, what initiatives are going on, and we're trying to advocate for our people. So quite often we're at housing events where there's no DS people there. We've got people within Community Living Toronto that we talk to also, so we kind of keep our ear to the ground, but we don't have real estate. Okay. Lights leads to long-term funding. Obviously, this is not in our power to grant. We are not the ministry. Sometimes I wish I could make those decisions, but then I think about it and I think, no, I just don't want that responsibility. Unfortunately, we are not able to guarantee long-term funding after the 5 years. For some families, this is a concern, rightfully so. But it's tough, right? Because if you don't start, you're never going to be any further ahead. So when families say, it's a big leap of faith, we say, yeah, it is. It is. That's what it is, right? So they have to be prepared for that. What it does do, I think, is having us involved helps put them in a better position should that funding become available. I've never heard of anyone that was worse off because of lights involvement. I'll put it to you that way. Being engaged with lights does not mean that you're taken off the DSO residential list for funding. If at anything, we make sure that you're on there, that your file's updated, and that you're waiting for the correct thing. Being engaged with lights will never impact any of your other funding. Lights can introduce individuals to potential roommates without any planning in place. And I say this because the number of emails I get from people saying, hey, I have this person. Do you think you could find them a roommate? And I say, well, it's pretty hard for me to match someone who I know nothing about, right? I mean, I don't know where you want to live. I don't know how much support you need. I don't know what kind of person you get along with. It's impossible. It's like if you're trying to introduce 2 of your friends because you think they could potentially date or get along or whatever. You got to know both of them, right? One of them smokes and the other one says, one of my deal breakers is smoking. That's going to be a problem if you don't know that. So in order to match people, we need to have some conversations with that person and figure out what they're looking for. So you can't go in blind. All right, so planning brings it all together. I think it can be hard for families to connect the dots sometimes. So bringing together all these different things, you know, the actual physical space, the support, maybe the family partnership, maybe the roommate, you know, also thinking about the long-term plan. We're really trying to connect all those dots with families, or we're working to support the families and connecting the dots for themselves. Okay. When we talk about partnership opportunities, again, I talk about the energy I think families need to put into this. And I think all these things are really important for families to do to take advantage of partnership opportunities. You know, we hear, you know, families say, well, I don't have the time, I don't have the energy, I can't meet anyone, but again, they're no further ahead, right? And I can totally hear that and understand that, but at the same time, we've got to have that engagement, right? So, I mean, to do that, you have to use the networking opportunities. If you're telling us you don't have the chance to meet people, but you're not coming out to our events, you know, there's a solution to that, right? Goal setting. I think they need to identify goals, and we work with them to identify goals. What are they looking for? You know, even when do they want their family member to move out by? That can be telling. Again, I talked about those families. They say, 5 years, Zoe, 5 years. It's not going to happen before 5 years. Okay. Or others that say next year, right? That's important in meeting with families because that speaks to readiness. Developing a clear philosophy, you know, back to my example about the house key. Some families see this as, it's a very symbolic thing, it is. Some families see this as, well, they need to get out there and they need to learn and we want to teach them. And that's not gonna work with another family that says, oh no, well they just need to be supervised. I want a housekeeper. I want someone to clean up. We need to have someone coming in and cleaning. We need to have Meals on Wheels delivered. That's probably not going to jive with a family whose idea of this is a teachable opportunity, and we want my family member to learn things so they could potentially live with less support down the road. So that's important in matching. You have to be open and honest. If you don't like something, you have to say it because it comes out eventually. So sometimes that can be hard. But to develop any kind of good partnership, they really have to be committed to saying what they mean and meaning what they say. Yeah, okay. Okay, I did say I was going to give you some resources, and I'm happy to send out this PowerPoint presentation if everyone would like. Is there, yes? All right. So these are sort of informally what we really like. Not endorsing any of them necessarily, but these are just something for you to think about. It's just a coincidence they all start with P. Alex was talking about Partners for Planning. They have a lot of really excellent webcasts. Quite often, Kirra and I listen to them to get more information for ourselves. We direct families to them quite a bit. They are generally pretty digestible, you know, short formats, visually appealing. I find they're quite comprehensive as well. They're a great resource. You know, talking about independent facilitation, especially around the idea of circles of support, right? Sometimes independent facilitation can be a really, really helpful tool in establishing a circle of support. That's a big thing that independent facilitators do, and it can be very helpful. I've had families tell me that actually. So finding an independent facilitator. I do know that I had a conversation with P4P yesterday. I do know that they are looking at some fee-for-service options, which Passport would be could cover if there's any Passport left. If not, could be out of pocket. So there's also a number of independent facilitators that are not part of any agencies. I suspect that number will probably go up. The Ontario Federation for Independent Facilitators, OFIN, is also an excellent resource for families, especially if they're outside the city of Toronto. So I recommend that. Foreign law. We talked about employment law. That's something that affects families. We're also talking about finances here, trusts, disability tax credit, things that impact ODSP. You know, even estate planning, right? I've heard stories where mom passes away quite suddenly without a will, leaves her Ontario teacher's pension to her daughter, and not paid into a trust, she gets cut off from ODSP. Estate planning. If you do one thing, plan your estate, parents. That's like my message to all parents. There's a really great guidebook that Poor-in-Law did with Community Living Ontario. It is an excellent resource for all things financial that are specifically geared around disability financial. There's some people out there that identify themselves as experts. Not everyone is. Poor-in-Law is generally the go-to in Toronto. Lots of free resources. And they do also take clients, but for free resources, excellent blog. Plan Institute, they're based in BC. Actually, P4P is sort of linked with them, but they're big on the People First movement, and they've released a tool. Now, I haven't gone through the entire tool. It's intended to be an individual family-directed tool to develop long-term plans. So it takes into account financial pieces as well. So there is an option to choose BC or Ontario. And I think for families who are looking to start thinking about it and maybe want to walk through, maybe they don't want to engage a facilitator, maybe they don't want to engage with lights just yet, maybe whatever reason, right? This can be a really good tool to send them down. And if you want to play around with it yourselves as a professional, I mean, why not, right? That's how we learn. So these are just a couple things. I mean, we're constantly talking to people and getting information, and that's part of our role, right, to be subject matter experts. And these are just some of the places that I think are really good sources of information for us, and they're really good for families. So I think they're good for everybody. Yeah, there's others out there, but we tend to use the first two especially a lot. Okay. Celebrations are important, I believe. So some things we're really proud of. I talked about how we don't go through the DSO, but we're funded by MCCSS. That in itself, there's 2 of us. We're full-time, permanent. We were really proud of that accomplishment. Obviously, the privately fundraised dollars we're really proud of. I didn't talk about that, but again, $7 million. I mean, I don't know. I'm not in fundraising, but I'm like, awesome. Good for you. And there's a lot of people, like over 69 people have moved out since we started. People that were at varying stages. And we interact with hundreds more people. And not everyone decides to do it right away, but people are starting to think about it. And that in and itself is so, so important that families are starting to consider that. So I think that we'll see, I think, long-term effects of this, but that's something that I think we're the most proud of. Yeah. I think that, yes. What time is it? Let's get a time check. All right, so we've got 15 minutes. So I'm happy to take questions. Since we don't have anything on our parking lot, I'm happy to take questions from anybody. I'm also going to leave our, we have some cards at the back. We also have some extra brochures if anyone would like to take a couple. And Kirra's also printed out. Kirra's an Aussie, so she found a really great Australian resource. That's actually, it is based in Australia, but it's something that I think families can really understand because it's talking about the pre-work, right? It's a great resource to get families thinking about it. So there's some copies at the back. You're welcome to take some. If you want an electronic copy, let us know. We'll send it out to you. We also do have a distribution list where we send out events and stuff like that. So what I did on the email list where you signed in, put a column at the side. If you would like me to add you to our email distribution list, just put a check in that column next to your name on your way out. That's it. Or Kirra put one there. Look at that. Kirra put one there.
Good, yeah.
Some of the stuff is the same as what Deanna sends out, so be prepared for that. But some of the stuff is unique. And it's good for families. Families can get on it. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to say. So I'm happy to take questions. Yes.
So what happens if a family member, two people are partnered together, but then years into it, one of the family members dies and there's no support for one of the individuals? Has that happened, or what would you do?
We've had partnerships break up. We haven't had an untimely death of a parent who's the person managing things. You know, we talk about succession planning a lot, right? We're working with a family now, and dad's in his early 80s, and one thing we're doing is the daughter has power of attorney over financial and health. They don't call it financial, they call it personal something. So we're involving the daughter. The idea is really that you're bringing in other people. Working with just one parent, and if something happens, that can really throw a wrench in the whole system, right? You know, I think in that case, we'd probably look at some crisis supports if that's happening, if the person's unable to manage. But that's part of the plan. Ideally, you know, how do you see this moving forward when you're no longer able to manage it? Some families are looking at this, like I said, as a stopgap solution, but they need to be prepared that there may not be ministry funding that comes out, and that's a risk, right? Just as all families are in the same boat with that. So there needs to be some thought of what that looks like. Does that answer that question?
So of the 69 people, I guess for me the question, one of the questions is home ownership. Who own, or you know, if I'm splitting an apartment with Melanie and we're not getting along, who's leaving?
Like, that's a case-by-case basis. Obviously, if one family owns the home, that the person doesn't own the home is leaving. Typically, that is something we talk about when we're forming a partnership agreement and what that looks like. So we talk about how much notice should you give, because it's not just an apartment, it's quite often shared support. We talk about if something should happen, how does this look? Both individuals' names are on the lease, which unfortunately is not the most common thing. Most building management companies prefer to have one person's name, and they often prefer a family member. That's typically a conversation between families, and it can change over time. I guess the idea is that if you have a partnership, I mean, it's similar to a relationship, right? If both partners' names are on the lease, then you have to have that conversation about what does that look like if we don't want to continue this partnership. You know, and I think that's where setting those families up to have, with that open, honest communication, to have that positive partnership can be really beneficial. We did have one instance where a woman moved into another woman's home that was purchased. She owned it, and there was an interesting thing that I learned in that if an individual shares common space, bathroom, kitchen, with the owner or a family member of the owner, then they're not eligible under the Landlord-Tenant Act. Yeah, pretty interesting, right? So that's something to be aware of. So we talk to families about this. We say, you know, ideally you want to have a good partnership with your family member, and you're 50% of that, right? But you should know if this goes south, then you don't have the same protection as other tenants. Yeah, and that's a risk. You know, I think they have to know that going in. You know, it still sometimes surprises me, the families that buy homes and have no idea what their responsibilities are. You know, we try and work with families, but sometimes families are going to do what they're going to do, and we're running after them saying, hey, did you think about this? Did you wonder about this? Did you talk to this person? And you can't guarantee they did it, but you can only advise, right? So there are risks, but the family really has to figure that out, ideally before they get into the partnership. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out the 20% part, looking on the website.
Mhm.
Now I'm in the families role.
Mhm.
Come up with a budget, I have to
Mhm.
contribute 20%.
20% of the gap.
Of the gap. And
So-
up to 80% of the gap could be funded through that 7 million. Is that
Potentially,
up to 5 years?
yes, potentially.
Again, have you had any families that needed that 80%? And what's the scramble, what's the process if I'm that family of, if that's gonna end in 5 years, how am I gonna find that other 80%?
Well, and that's a great question. Just to clarify for everyone else, just because I'm not sure if everyone read that. So the budgeting process to access funding, we do an individualized budget, so per person, right? And we don't do any means testing for families, but we do an individualized budget. So typically income is ODSP, passport if they're lucky enough to have it, any other income. So that's considered income for the individual. And then we go through all of the costs that are associated with that person in their life. Everything, right? What are the costs that they have to live their life? And then we are typically left with a gap. So their income is, $30,000 and, the total cost of their life is $60,000. So that's the $30,000 is the gap, right? So when we're doing that budget, we can identify that families, if they're going to access funding, that they first of all need to have a gap, right? Families need to contribute a minimum of 20% of that gap. So if it's 10,000, families need to contribute 2,000. So, and obviously, Lights has a cap of how much funding we can give. So if it's more than that, if it's a huge gap, families need to contribute more heavily. So what happens after 5 years? It's a good question. It's a good question. We have been able to access some long-term funding for some families, just based on the fact that the ministry doesn't have a process for individualized funding at this point in time. But what's that going to look like? I don't know. It's kind of Brad that's working on that and advocating to the ministry. Our business case is that, well, these families have this model. It's a reasonable cost compared to, some other, potentially funded vacancies. But it's different, right? It tends to be a bit more cost effective, but that's because the family is contributing and managing a lot of things. So what happens after that 5 years is, I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. But again, when we say it's a risk, yes it is. But if you don't take the risk, then you don't move forward, right? You don't have anything. And if your idea is that they'll move home after 5 years, then you've had that opportunity, right? You're in a much better position to advocate. But we can't make money appear out of thin air, unfortunately. Yeah. So that is the question that I don't have a good answer to. But I'm not sure there's any other better answers out there at this point. I don't know, Alex, what do you think? Thank God you stuck around, eh? DSO.
Thank God. So one thing I could have mentioned when I spoke, so as Zoe said, there isn't a process right now to access individualized residential funding, and there isn't a formal waiting list for it. However, that is something that I am tracking. So when I'm speaking with individuals, and it was something that was a part of the community needs list, so we've pulled that information from the community needs list, and then also when I'm speaking to individuals, I'm keeping track of that so that we are able to report back to the ministry around that information. So,
yeah, we want to have that information ready should they want it. Deanna's been involved in that too. Okay. Other questions? Families still can be waiting for individualized funding through the community needs list. Some assessors, I mean, I spoke with the DSO, they can't anymore? Oh,
We're
no.
not using the,
But it's still there, right?
I'm here.
yes, so, okay.
You're not
So
using it to
we're
sort.
we're using the community needs list for individuals who are interested in person-directed planning and family support workers. So what assessors have been directed to do when they are speaking to a family or an individual who has an interest in individualized planning and funding is to let me know. So whether or not the family wants to connect with me and actually get resources from the housing navigator, if they're okay with me tracking that information, assessors have been asked to report that information back to me so that it can still be captured. If an individual is not interested in FSW and PDP, person-directed planning supports, that may not get captured on the community needs list going forward. So definitely I want to know about that so I can keep track of that information. But it's kind of an offline list.
I want to add just one question. Hello? Yeah, morning. Yeah. One question. So, scenario, individual is going through DSO waiting for residential services. In the meantime, that is a long wait. People know that. They contact you, they get involved in lights, and then they come up for residential services. Can they take that residential funded spot, leave lights? Have you had that
Absolutely.
before, and how does that work?
It has happened a couple times. It's awesome when it happens. We always tell families, if your name comes up and the DSO calls you, say you're interested and say you want to look at it. That's it. Because for a lot of families, they're waiting, right? And if something permanent funded comes up, then we are going to work with them to explore that. And they have the decision to make ultimately if that's a good match for them. But if that, lottery is won, then I, in the back of my mind, really hope that works out. I really do. So it's pretty easy, actually. I mean, once they move in, then we end them in lights. We close them because we don't work with people who have residential funding. They have people that work with them that are, assigned to them because they're funded. And then we sort of move them over to wherever they are. And that's it.
The next question I have is the individuals that go through your program obviously get some really great enhanced skills. Maybe increase their skills in terms of their self-help, all that good stuff. Are they updating DSO to let them know what their abilities are in terms of their support needs and that sort of thing? Because it might change where they are sitting in terms of where the residential support required is.
Absolutely. I think this is part of where our involvement too can benefit families because we are encouraging them to contact the DSO. If the family calls me and says, well, this is happening, my first question is usually, does the DSO know about this? They can only match you with things if they know what's going on. I think sometimes families are like, oh, I called them last year, I don't want to keep bugging them. Like, no, that's what they're there for. Bug them as much as you want to bug them. Call them every day if you want. We'll give you Alex's personal bug. all generous. No, but Alex is great though, because she talks with our folks, and even sometimes ones that have had negative experiences with the DSO, and it's good. So yes, they are. We are really wanting to set them up for any funding opportunity at all, right? Again, some families see themselves on this pathway, and that's the only thing that's going to work for them. That's how they feel. Some families would like to have a funded spot. And some agencies are open to opening things up. There have been agencies that have bundled in the past. There are opportunities for conversation with some agencies. So, that's what we're there for.
I have a question that kind of goes back to Deanna's previous question. So if somebody were to come up with for SIL hours, so not SIL supports attached to a residence.
Yeah.
Semi-independent living.
Sorry. is there a way for that to work? Obviously, we wouldn't continue to receive support and funding through Lights, but can that be worked into a Lights arrangement?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, so with cell hours only, right? If they already have a place and they're living in it, then those are really good candidates for cell hours only. And for some people, that is the goal, right? For some people, the gap is that support. So cell hours only is actually a really good option. So the funding, we can't have Lights funding and ministry funding running at the same time. But if still hours only came up, then that would take over from Lights funding, and that would give the family some, peace of mind, I think, continuing in service with an agency. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're not the people that are renting the apartments, right? So the families quite often are renting the places, or they own the places. We've got a small number of head leased apartments, but it doesn't mean that you have to leave necessarily, right? And the number of head leased apartments is so small. It's not the usual. So, yeah.
Sorry, just. Maybe you were just answering this question. Okay, now I'm living with you. I get funding, now my ministry funding comes in. Can I keep living with him?
Sure. Why not?
So one of us is getting ministry funding, one of us is straight Lights.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
That's fine. I mean, each budget is individualized, right? So there are some instances where families don't need funding or don't want funding. It doesn't stop them from living with whoever they want to live with, because we're working with individuals, and whoever they partner with is up to them. So, yeah, I mean, the funding isn't like typical in that funding is attached to a site where there's maybe 3 bedrooms. We're doing it per person. Each budget is per person. So it's meant to move wherever they go and partner with whoever they want to partner with. I mean, where sometimes we run into trouble is where sometimes people have pretty high budgets and they require agency staffing. And for people who are funding that privately, that can be prohibitively expensive. If one person's got a $600,000 budget per year and the other person's expected to contribute to the same amount, that's going to be pretty tough to do with personal funding. So, looking at the support, what that means, but then there's self-managing families. I mean, it's really tied to the particular situation, right? And what that looks like.